Okay, so game object lifecycle. Um, hello? Okay. Okay, game object lifecycle. So here I have my enemy class inside my user code for the game. Um, to prevent basically doing unnecessary news and deletes every time I want to create an enemy. I have a factory essentially managing all of the active enemies. Um, has a pool set up on it, so I'm only creating as many enemies as I need. I'm not creating any more. Um, but what this means is that since I'm not deleting enemies, um, instead I need a way of deactivating them, and that's where the life cycle comes in. Um, so here, to say an enemy is hit, instead of deleting it, I call a submit exit, which works a lot like the registration commands on the UBLs. Within game object, it sends a, let's pull up game object. Within game object, well, first of all, game objects have their own registration state and registration commands associated with them, called entry and exit commands. Um, so when I submit for exit, um, I submit it just like every other registration command. I submit it to the scene to be processed by the command broker. Um, so then submit exit passes the deregistration command, and then let me pull up deletion entry exit. Then exit calls disconnect from scene on the game object that's submitted for exit. So disconnect from scene, disconnect to scene. Okay, so it probably should be called disconnect from scene, but I don't know. It essentially does what it needs to. So this calls scene exit. Scene exit is my user defined method where the user states what needs to happen. So this is where they uh, submit all their other deregistration. So here's my scene exit. This is where they're deregistering all their other stuff from the scene. And then, yeah. So then if, I believe in this spawner. So if the user wanted to create another enemy using the factory, um, what they could do is call, actually no, so they go through the factory, but then the factory will call submit entry to add a to and essentially re-register an enemy back to the current scene. So yeah, and here create enemy, either create a new enemy, I grab it from the top, or I grab it from the top. If I do this, then the enemy is currently inactive, and then to actually activate it, I call submit entry, and then it's just like registration from the other UBLs. It's just like deregistration from scene exit. Um, scene never mind. So within the within the factory, submit entry is called. Essentially goes through similar channels. Submit entry is called. It passes the registration command to the scene, and the scene command broker, the command broker, uh, executes the command, and that will then call connect to scene, which then calls scene entry on the actual object. So then this would call scene entry and perform all these registrations. So that's lifecycle for the game object. Um, so then, aside from that, I think the last thing is 2D sprite. 2D sprites, yes. So, the way I have it set up, let me pull up game object. The way I have it set up, a game object also inherits from drawable 2D for sprites and stuff. This works really similar to drawable in terms of registration, deregistration. So yeah. So yeah, you have your registration, deregistration commands. However, the way I have it set up, a user doesn't necessarily, well, because of just the complicated call needed to create a sprite, I just created a separate, and the fact that for sprites, you may want to play around with like the origin of the sprite, and that depend in order to, yeah, never mind. So yeah, like say you want to have a sprite, but you also want to change its origin. So I created a sprite object on the engine side. So this is responsible for holding and editing a given sprite. So actually, let me pull up ship, because that'll be a better way of that would help me explain it. Do I have it on ship? No, I don't. I have it on sprite test. Okay. Okay. So sprite test, this is a user side game object that I was just using to test the sprite stuff. So it doesn't store the graphic object for the sprite. Instead, it stores a sprite object. And then the sprite object itself stores the graphics object sprite. So then, to actually create a sprite, just call new sprite object, give it its image, its position on screen, and its height and width. And so yeah, that passes it over to the sprite object, which actually creates it. So do I have it? No. Good definition. So then this will automate a lot of the sprite creation. It grabs the image, the corresponding model and shader, and takes the image and the given dimensions and actually creates the graphic object and stores that as along with the origin. So then to actually update the sprite, just like any other graphics object, the user calls set world on the sprite object, which will then call set world on the within this sprite object, which will call set world on the actual graphics object for the sprite. With the small caveat being that it takes into account the origin, and sets the and applies the world matrix in relation to the origin. And then the user just calls render and it renders it to the orthographic camera that's specifically for the sprites. So yeah, so that's sprites. Yeah, and yeah, that's sprites and collisions. No, sprites and life cycle.